got it.
Okay, well, we are here, Romans chapter 6, continuation of last time. Last time was Romans chapter 6. We got through the introduction to chapter 6, and basically 1 through 3. Verses 1 through 3 is where we got to. Hopefully tonight we'll cover a little bit of ground. Maybe. We'll see. And we're talking chapter 6, this part that we're talking about here. We're going to be talking about the faithfulness of God. And the part specifically what we're going to be talking about tonight is identification, which is a huge thing for us. And it's a great thing for us. And that goes along with the concept that grace is not only a saving factor, but it's a sustaining factor. And that identification helps explain that concept. We talked about that a little bit in chapter 6, verses 2 and 3, but we'll continue with that as we move on to verse 4 and so on. Can you read that real fast and see what that says?
No battery.
Oh, just hit. Makes it, if it doesn't. All right. Okay, identification. Identification is one of those things that is super great, super helpful, super important to us. But it's also kind of a difficult concept to understand because it's a little bit abstract, I guess you could say. When you deal with factual things, like I've talked about before, when you deal with factual things, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it is what it is, 2 plus 2 of a concept. Sometimes they're harder to grasp that thing, and identification is one of those things. It's really, once you get a hold of it, once you understand it, super easy. But once again, it's one of those things that you kind of have to try and sift through. So identification is kind of what we're talking about here, and that's kind of where we left off. That's where we're going to start off here today. So if we refresh our brains a little bit, we'll read chapter 6, verses 1, 2, and 3, just for that, to help us understand the concept of identification. It says, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin, that grace may abound? Certainly not. How shall we who died to sin live in it any longer?" Verse 3, "Or do you not know that as many of us who were baptized in Christ Jesus were baptized into his death?" This concept of baptism is not water baptism, of course. Some other translations will change the word baptism, actually, into identification, which is what we're talking about here. And that being identified is the key. When Jesus died, he took our punishment for us, and now we are identified with him. It's as if we were in the courts and, we were pronounced guilty, and all of a sudden Jesus stood up in our place and said, "Hey, I'm going to take the punishment for you. I'll take his place." You know what I mean? We are now, in the legal sense, identified with that person who took the spot for us. So when they look at us and they say, why are you here? When you're, standing before the pearly gates, why are you here? Well, I'm identified with, I paid the penalty for my sin. I'm identified with Jesus. And they go, "Oh, okay, good." So not only are we identified with that, which is kind of what verses 1 through 3 kind of talk about. Should we continue sinning? If sin's so bad and grace is so much greater, well, how about we continue to sin? No, that's not how it works. We're talking about this identification. So, and it works both ways. We're identified with Christ. We will be identified with Christ, and Christ will be our stand-in, so to speak, to take our punishment, like we talked about before, into heaven. But on the other side of the coin, we need to also keep into consideration that we are identified with him. Like, what we do reflects upon him. And actually going to talk about that this coming Sunday, but I'm going to talk about it here too. But we need to make sure we know that, because here it tells us that not only are we identified with his death, but we're identified with his life as too. Also, because when he took our sin from us, when he died, he credited us that, we were then had the slate wiped clean. And then once he came back to life, he credited us that blessing, that wonderful acceptance into this new life of grace. So his righteousness is now imparted to us. Through his righteousness, he died for us. Now his righteousness covers us and keeps us where we need to be as far as our spiritual account goes. We're all set, ready to go. That's the concept of grace and the concept of identification. You guys got that, right? I mean, the whole thing with identification, okay? Now, we need to think even beyond that. We think of identification sometimes in the context of what's going on here, which is that we have identification with his death and his resurrection. We now have, got the penalty paid for us, and now we have eternal life. Those things are great. But we also, even beyond that, now that we're identified with Christ, we now have access to all the benefits that Jesus has. We now have access to God the Father. We have access to heaven. We have access to things beyond our means. People always have that. You watch those stories, those Hallmark movies or whatever, where some kid comes out. I know you don't, and we don't watch those things, but some kid grew up some orphan, and they didn't have anything, and then all of a sudden somebody comes out of nowhere and they're royalty, and then all of a sudden they have access to the royal court and all these, it's all cool and stuff like this. That's exactly what we did. That fairy tale has come true for us, and it's not a fairy tale. It's a fact of spiritual truth. So we now are identified with that. Now, to help us to understand that a little bit further, Paul gets into a little bit more of a explanation here in the next few verses. And to do that, he just kind of digs into that concept of identification and all the benefits that we have a little bit deeper, so that we can understand and appreciate how we need to live. Remember, our life is lived, we are called to be his ambassadors here on earth. And we are identified with him in that people look at us and see God in us, hopefully. And if we act a fool, then of course they see a foolish believer and those types of things. So we want to make sure that our identification is used in a way that's hopefully beneficial. It's beneficial for us, of course, because we're not going to hell. But making sure that this grace continues on even further. So,
written in my Bible, chapter 6 is the key to godly living.
Yes, absolutely. That's what it is. And that's the whole thing. It's, the approach I'm coming with is making sure that you understand you're identified with somebody, but it is the key to godly living. And if we weren't living a good godly life, and we're identified with God, people are going to look at us and go, why would I bother with God? You know what I mean? Why would I bother doing the life you're living when it's no different than my life, type of a thing. So we got to have that godly living. We got to show that there's a definite distinction there. So Paul, in these next few verses, all the way till for a while now, or maybe through 14, I want to say, possibly all the way through 14, he brings up this explanation of how this godly living type of a thing, being identified with him. And he explains 3 different things that we kind of need to keep into consideration when we are looking at these verses. And maybe it'll help you, all right? So Paul explains that Christian truth is vital to our lives. So the thing that we're going to look for, first off, is truth. The second thing that he does is he outlines the significance of this identification, okay? And that's something that we need to consider, okay? Consider is going to be a word that comes up quite a bit. Or it's a pivotal word, I guess you could say. So know, all right, know and consider. And the last word that we're going to kind of see is how he concludes the whole thing and how we apply it to our lives. So that's how we present ourselves to the world and how we live our lives. Okay, so look for those three concepts as we start off. We're going to start with the first one, and that is truth. Now, look to verse 4 here, chapter 6, verse 4, and it says, "Therefore, we were buried with him through baptism of death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in the newness of life." This is really important about this identification. It's, once again, kind of refreshing our memory of everything that I just talked about here, how we're identified with him. But remember how we started the beginning of this chapter. We talked about how freedom, Abraham Lincoln, he declared the slaves free. And a lot of those slaves didn't really change much of their life. Just because they were pronounced free didn't mean they experienced that freedom. You know what I mean? And unfortunately, sometimes in the Christian life, it's the same thing. We are made free, but we don't experience that. And that starts with truth. If we don't understand that we're no longer in that bondage, there's no guarantee that we're going to experience the wonderment of freedom. Okay? I hope that makes sense to you. And Paul uses a couple of different words here to try and get you to understand something. He says in verse 4, therefore, he says so that. He says so that a lot, a couple of times. And these words therefore and these words so that are important words because they are showing us that whatever is coming after the therefore, what you're reading is therefore whatever concept that came before. It's a continuation of the thought that happened before. So in verse 3, we saw that we were baptized into his death. Therefore, continuing on with that thought of that death, we were buried with him through the baptism unto his death. So you see how that therefore is just a transition going from one to the next. Just moving right into it. Okay? That type of thing. All right? So the person must first know that he or she has been released. And we see that therefore, what he's saying there in verse 3 is that we must understand this death, this identification with the death, and we need to know that those things we are now separated from that old life. Okay? And that's super important. All right? Some people, yeah, it's running low on power. It just says that it's low on power. Most people, once again, we need to make sure that we understand that this identification, it uses the word baptism. Once again, it's not baptism with water. Baptism with water is not intended, nor was it ever intended to save anybody. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about this identification. So I don't want to focus on the actual word that's used there, baptism, because it's not what it's talking about. It's talking about identification. And with that identification, we need to understand, we need to know that we are no longer under that weight of sin. We're identified with that death, meaning we're identified with Christ and the punishment. We're recognizing the punishment, which is death. We're recognizing that he is the one that took it for us. Okay? And then we move on to 5 through 7. And it says, verse 4, therefore, we are buried with him through the baptism of the death, just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in the newness of life. I'll come back to that. For if we have been united together in the likeness of his death, certainly we also shall be in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin. For he who has died has been freed from sin. And that's verse 7 is kind of like a summary of that whole concept. You got to understand the identification thing and know it to be true. You know what I'm saying? So our identification with his death is an identification with the whole story. We're not just identified with a singular act. We're identified with the person, is what this is saying. And that's huge because Christ did so much more than just die. I can do that. But I can't raise myself back to life. That's the key part. And being identified with Christ means we're being identified with the whole body of his work, not just a singular act. So here we see at the end of 4 into 5 that we have this newness of life. We have this newness of life, and we're identified with that newness of life. We're identified with that he has come back. We are identified with his new body. We're identified with everything. You know, we need to make sure that we understand that we are now new creatures. Okay? When the day comes when we pass from this life to the next, everything's going to be different. Okay? When Jesus died, he died, and then he rose again. When he rose again, it was a whole different ball game, a whole different program. The body that he had, just the body itself, is different, completely different. And it's important for us to understand that because it tells us very specifically that our old man, in verse 6, was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away with. And we're no longer slaves to that. Now, like I said, when we pass from this life to the next, it's going to be a different ballgame. When Jesus rose from the dead, he obtained a new body that is no longer subject to the idea of death and the consequences thereof. When Jesus walked the earth, he raised Lazarus from the dead. You know what I mean? But later on in life, Lazarus died. I mean, he brought him back to life in that instant, but he didn't change, he didn't transform his body into something different. He just brought him back to life for that moment. And then later on in life, he succumbed to the normal ravages of what it is to live a human life. He eventually died. Okay? Now we, 1 John 3, 2 through 3 tells us that we are going to be like Jesus. We are now going to be not just identified, but we are going to be transformed like Jesus. We're not going to be subject to those things. The sin, the pain, the suffering, the anguish, those things are not going to be part of us. But also death is not going to be part of what we have to deal with when that time comes. But unfortunately, that's not where we're at right now. Right now we're living here on earth. So even though we are identified spiritually with him, with Jesus, and we're identified spiritually with his death, identified spiritually with his resurrection, and we now have this new citizenship in this place called grace that we talk about so often in this Bible study. These are all wonderful things, but we're still here. And we still have this old body. We still are struggling to get along as we are. Just kind of is what it is. So what do? Well, this is the important part. We got to know what side we're on. We got to know that we're identified with him. We got to know that things can be different. And if we do know those things, we can actually, in this life, live a life that's a little bit better. It's not going to be ideal. Anything this side of heaven isn't ideal. But it is going to be better. And it's going to be magnificent for us, filled with blessings and wonderment, if we do that. The phrase that's used there, and we must, and the only way to do that, first off, before I get going on that, the only way to do that is to claim it. We got to claim it, we got to own it, we got to make it part of who we are. Okay? God says, okay, I'm laying out the red carpet for you, here's the keys to the city, but you're not going to be able to do anything with it if you don't claim it. You don't decide to live it. You know what I mean? And it's super easy to be complacent with where you are and not live it.